Hey everyone. In today's video, we're going to talk about processing and organizing and editing raw photos. Ever since I've been making these YouTube videos, I've been trying to shoot in raw format, and it's been a little overwhelming, frankly. So I took a couple of weeks and I planned and I thought about it and I organized and I hopefully came up with a system that was a little bit better for dealing with all the raw photos that I'm shooting. And I thought I would take you guys through that. Step one is to create a file structure. Creating a file structure is important because you want to stay organized when you're dealing with so many raw photos side by side with JPEG images, which is how I shoot. So I have two images in the file system, one with a raw format file tag, file extension, there we go, and another with a JPEG file extension. You need to stay organized however is best for you. You can use a date-based structure, you can use an event-based structure or location-based structure. For me, I import the photos into a folder with the current year. And then within that year photo is a date. I've experimented with different file names for this video, but I haven't really been able to come up with anything better than the default file name that the camera gives. I thought about adding the f-stop number to the name, or perhaps the ISO or the lens that I'm using. But if I do that, there always seems to be a problem somehow with the idea of lots of duplicate files potentially coming up if things go into the same folder. Until I can find a better system to do, I'm going to stick with that default naming system that my camera gives me. If you guys have a better system, please let me know in the comments below, because I would love to have more information on how to name files instead of just keeping them in the default, because I know that there can be some problems with that too. Once you've imported your photos from your camera onto your computer, you need to import them into your editing program. I use AC/DC Photo Studio Ultimate something or other, and it doesn't actually require you to import anything. It's a little bit like a file browser in that way, but I know that other systems like Lightroom or Capture One do require you to import them into your workflow, into a separate database. I use AC/DC Photo Studio because it's a single payment without any monthly charges, and I generally only upgrade when I get a new camera, which isn't all that often, so it ends up saving me a lot of money. But you use whatever's right for you. Next is culling. After I've imported the photos and before I start to edit, I need to cull the photos, and that just means I go through the ones that I don't like and I pull them out. I select the blurry ones, the out of focus ones, ones where the subject is out on the very far side of a picture, or some other technical problem for the most part. Depending on how many shots I've taken, I will do a double or a triple or even a quadruple pass over the images, and pull them out a little bit at a time. And sometimes I'll focus on the composition, or I'll focus on one set of pictures where I took a lot of one person walking across a street or something like that. And I'll look for the 2 or 3 or even the one that is the best of that, and then I will mark the rest for deletion. I try not to do too many at one time, just because I don't want to get too happy with the delete button and start setting too many things for deletion. I'm not so terribly worried about losing an amazing image that will come back to haunt me in 10 years, because I'm not a professional and I don't really post these in a lot of different places. It's mostly for myself. So I'm not so broken up. I'm gonna forget about the image once I've deleted it, so there's no real reason to hold on to it. But at the same time, I do want to be careful with what I delete. So I take a few passes over it until I've gone through and selected most everything that I don't want to keep anymore. The way I do this in AC/DC is I will take photos that I want to keep and give them the number 2. And I do this with the RAW photo format and the JPEG format. The photos that I don't want to keep, because this hand is definitely not nearly as good as this hand, is I will give it the number 1. And of course, there's a shortcut to make this easier. And I can give it any number I want. And I can select as many as I want in any combination that I want. And then when I'm done, I simply select them based on their numbers, and then I delete them. It's as simple as that. If I change my mind, I can always take away the number and start over again. Once you've culled the bad ones, you can choose a good one and finally get to editing. This is where I worked a lot to try to come up with a good system. Let me tell you what I did. First was rotation. I'm terrible at shooting an image level, and so I very often need to nudge a horizon up to get everything to look right. So that's what I do in this section. Sometimes an image might look interesting when it's not level, but unless I purposely shot it that way, I usually don't change the leveling on it, just because that wasn't what I had planned for. I like to see what it looks like the way I wanted it to be originally. Next comes exposure. Exposure is just how much light I give the image. I tend lately to shoot a little or a lot underexposed to pull it up later in the editor. I'm really interested in light, and I don't want anything to be blown out, which means the highlights are too high to see any details. I try to keep the brightness down a little bit, as you can see in this image here. Editors might have different names for those things, but every editor is going to have them, so you'll find them pretty easily. Next comes contrast. Contrast is adjusting the lights and the darks of the image to achieve the balance that I want. I've played around a little and created some really contrasty images that don't look much like the original image, but I feel the same about this as I do with other artistic manipulations of an image. I'm not really quite ready to commit to them as anything other than an experiment at this point. This contrast phase also includes other little dials that perform similar features, like clarity and dehaze, but I don't use them very often. I might sometimes come back to this section after I've worked a little bit more with the color. So I'm not entirely sure if this is the right location for this particular editing technique. If you guys have any suggestions about where I ought to give it a try instead, let me know in the comments below. Next on the list is color. Color refers to white balance, saturation, vibrance, desaturation, all that stuff. This is where I play around the most. I don't really know what the hell I'm doing, so it really comes down to me clicking an icon or moving a slider or an eyedropper and just seeing what happens. The biggest editing I do usually is if I will change a photo from color to black and white. I don't do that very often because if I shoot in black and white, I'm shooting in black and white, and if I'm shooting in color, it's rare that I will find a color image that I think is better as a black and white, but I do it occasionally. One of the rules that I try to follow as I'm editing is less is more. I don't like the overly saturated photos that I see online sometimes. If it looks so saturated that it can't be real, I'm inclined to not like that as much. So I try to not do that in my own photography. But to each their own. Some people really like the colors that pop, and that's for them. It's just not for me. Next is detail. And that means sharpening the image, removing noise, and things along those lines. This is a section where you can do fancy editing techniques too, if you know how to use them. I only know a single technique, and I don't even remember where I learned it, but it comes from YouTube. The technique is to make a copy of the original image as a layer, import it into Nik Silver Efex Pro. I got this free online several years ago when Google was giving it away. Select the High Structure Smooth option, and then put it into a luminosity channel. Then just tone it down till it looks good. It doesn't work for everything, like this hand doesn't really look better with this technique, but it can bring out a lot of detail on some images. Again, I call out to you guys. If you have some cool technique like that, that isn't too terribly complicated, put that in the comments below or a link to it. I would love to know little things like that to help the images look better. And then finally comes cropping. Sometimes I know I want to crop an image, when I take the shot, but other times I don't know that I want to crop something until I get into the editing process a little bit. That's why I wait till the end. I want to try to get the image right before I press the shutter button, but that's not always possible. So I shoot wide and crop later. Talking about cropping, however, leads on to talking about composition, and composition is a whole video on its own. So we'll leave cropping here for now and move on. After that, there's nothing left to do except export your photo. Be sure to choose the appropriate file format and size for your needs. I've noticed that some of my photos on Instagram get cut off on the top or the bottom, and so I have reformatted my images to accommodate that a little bit better, leaving a border at the top or the bottom. Some people might think it looks weird, but it reminds me a little bit of a printed photo, and so I don't mind it quite so much. At this point, I want to mention that my book, The Tangents of 22, is available on Amazon, and you can purchase it as an ebook or as a printed copy. It is full of big, interesting, great words like photosynthesis. Is photosynthesis actually in there? Yes, it is actually in there. Photosynthesis is in this book. I will leave a link to it in the description. And if you happen to be scrolling down to that description and you pass by the like and the subscribe buttons, hit those two on the way down. I'd really appreciate it. And there you have it. Basic organization and workflow for raw photos. I don't have a system in place yet for dealing with the multiple JPEG and RAW photos that are created in my camera. I prefer to have the JPEG side by side with the RAW photo, but it's really a lot of images, and if you guys have a better way of dealing with those, I would really appreciate your knowledge in that regard. So again, let me know. And otherwise, thanks for watching. I'll see you guys soon. Bye.